Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm going to conclude my discussion on Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? The first part of the video was, in this section of the series and theories, was devoted to just clarifying some of the key concepts within Spivak, because it's all too often that we run into errors of equivocation in attempting to understand a theorist, but specifically Spivak, since her writing style and sort of the technicality of the article is extremely dense. It's important to make sure that we have a good understanding of what it is that she means when she says representation, or when she says subaltern or oppressed, and so on. So the first part was just to clarify it. This part, I'm not going to go through and give like a Cliff Notes version. The point of my lectures is not to, it's not like, and I'm not knocking what Cliff Notes does, but I'm not giving a Cliff Notes version of her essay. The point is to identify some of the key elements, the general theme of the essay, and then use the videos as a supplement to your education. So if you're reading the essay and you're watching the video as a supplement to your reading, then the video should help clarify parts of sort of some of the density. It'll make the opaque nature of some of the aspects of the, not just her article, but anything that I cover, a little bit more transparent. So again, I am in no sense going to go into the full detail, a full-blown analysis of Spivak's Subaltern, because the series that I'm doing, this specific series, is about just theories. And this section of the analysis is post-colonial theory and the idea of the subaltern. Her text is a canonical text in this discourse, so I'm going to give a very, very general account, and I will leave it to you and your colleagues or your professors to discuss in detail more of the considerations. So again, this is not going to be a Cliff Notes version. I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow. I'm going to give you sort of a holistic account of what's happening, and then we'll move on to other concepts within post-colonial, postmodern theory. Okay, so this is theories again, and this is section 4.2. Alright, and roughly what we're attempting to do is to understand the motivation of the piece. What is guiding Spivak in her attempt to shed light on this notion of the subaltern? We see that a vast majority of her analysis is set in opposition to Foucault and Deleuze's account of subjectivity. Foucault and Deleuze's account, according to Spivak, of subjectivity comes as a consequence, I've said this before, comes as a consequence of this unified notion of interest and desire within the subject. In a Marxist interpretation, we have a dislocation between interest and desire within the subject, which creates this profound, fundamental schism within the individual, and we've seen how that sort of, that schism between interest and desire manifests within sort of Marxist theory, this division between labor and value, right? So I talked about that before. What we're going to see now, and what she does, which is very, very important, is she takes the concepts that we discussed before, this notion of the formation of subjectivity, her account in alignment with a Marxist account of subject formation as a consequence of class consciousness, in opposition to this French post-structuralist account of subjectivity. And now she gives us an example. So in the first series, in 4.1 of this series, we had the conceptual framework with which we could talk about subject identity formation as a consequence of class consciousness, right? Now what we're going to do is look at a specific example. So she uses that framework, and she gives a specific example of the relationship between British colonial system, Hindu law, and, if you will, Indian, well, I'll talk about it in more detail, the Indian woman's plight under this British colonial system. So now she's going to really, put some meat to the analysis. So the first point is to recognize, and the subject heading is under the British codification of Hindu law. Again, very generalized account. I'm not going to go into the various aspects of the Hindu law or how it was applied. I'm just giving you a sort of a general account, and you can flesh out the details in your own research. All right. So the codification in this law. If you look at the note, I put a note down there, it's actually far more than just the codification of law, right? It's the structuring of subalternity. Now, this claim might be a little bit more of a forceful claim, but I want to, before I begin, sort of set the stage. Insofar, and she says this is her quote, right? It's a direct quote from Can the Subaltern Speak? The British codification of Hindu law. Her analysis is not about the law. Right? She does analyze the law, but she analyzes the law and the attempt for the Brits to codify Hindu law as a means of discussing women's subjective identity. Right? So we're not just looking at the law. It's not a laundry list of all the things that the Brits did to codify Hindu law. That's not what's at stake here. Right? That is merely a means to what's at the heart of her analysis, which is subaltern identity, if you want to say identity, but some subaltern subjectivity within the Indian woman under the law, right? And specifically speaking, this idea of the relationship between the law and identity comes as a consequence of, and many people within the third world know this, Chinua Achebe, which I'll discuss later, says anytime I forget exactly how the quote goes. Anytime the white man brings his religion, his politics are close to follow. Something to that effect. So what ends up happening, I'll give a sense for those, and the majority of my viewers live in the U.S., but, and I know it's global, I know these lectures are global, but as a U.S. example, in the United States of America, there were Jim Crow laws, right? And we use the term law sort of loosely here, right? The whole point of Jim Crow laws were to establish a system in which African Americans could self-police themselves, in which they would create this hierarchy of better and worse African Americans. And basically what ended up happening, to make a long story short, is the masters favored those African Americans that were mulatto, that were mixed, and I discussed this earlier, right? Those African Americans that were blacker, that were literally darker, became demonized by members of their own community, right? So that the fairer you were, the lighter you were, in the African community, American community, we call it red. The redder you were, the browner you were, the better you were, right? So that there was a system in place, the law, quote unquote, established a structure, and that structure created a system of oppression. This is precisely what's being addressed here, right? All of that summarizes a lot of technical things that Spivak says in the piece, but the idea is that, and I'm going to read a quote to demonstrate this in a second, the idea was we, the British colonial masters, need to enact a system in which Indian population can self-regulate under British rule, right? So willingly, in a sense, oppress themselves, willingly take a subjected and oppressive role, an objective role in service of colonial mastership. So here's the quote, part 2, line 2. So the first thing was implementation, if you will, implementation of the law as a mechanism of, technically speaking, epistemic violence, generally speaking, control. Right? It's the attempt to implement law as a mechanism of epistemic violence, of control. Again, this goes back to Galtung's theory of structural violence, and I gave examples with respect to Jonathan Kosel's account of the relationship between property tax and educational opportunities. Same contextual idea.